On the 30th of April, 1943, a fishing boat off the southern coast of Spain pulled something from the Atlantic that would alter the entire trajectory of World War II. It was the body of a British military officer floating face down in a life jacket near the port town of Huelva. Strapped to his wrist by a chain was a locked briefcase. Inside that briefcase were letters between senior Allied generals outlining the next major invasion of Europe. Within days, those letters would reach the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. They would convince him to redirect tens of thousands of German troops away from the real Allied target. And every single word in those letters was a lie. What nobody knew at the time was that the dead officer was not an officer at all. He was not even a soldier. He was a homeless man from Wales who had swallowed rat poison in a London warehouse. And the two men who turned his corpse into the most convincing spy in British history were about to pull off the greatest military deception of the 20th century. If you had asked anyone in Allied command about the situation in early 1943, they would have told you the same thing. The war was at a turning point, and everybody knew it. British and American forces had just finished driving the German Afrika Korps out of North Africa after years of brutal desert fighting. Rommel's army had been beaten. The Mediterranean was almost within reach. The question was no longer whether the Allies would invade Europe from the south. The question was, where? And the answer was painfully obvious. Sicily, the island sitting right off the toe of Italy like a football being kicked across the sea. It was the largest island in the Mediterranean, and it was the most logical stepping stone from North Africa into mainland Europe. Every general on both sides of the war knew it. Winston Churchill knew it. The American Joint Chiefs knew it. And critically, the German High Command knew it too. Churchill reportedly said something to the effect of, "Anyone but a damn fool would know it is Sicily." The problem was not planning the invasion. The problem was that the Germans would be waiting for them when they got there. With over 300,000 Axis troops stationed across the Mediterranean theater, the invasion of Sicily could turn into a bloodbath if Germany reinforced the island before the Allies arrived. The British needed the Germans to look somewhere else, anywhere else. They needed to convince Adolf Hitler that Sicily was a decoy, a diversion from the real targets. And to do that, they turned to one of the strangest ideas in the history of warfare. The concept actually started with a memo. It was called the Trout Memo because it compared the art of deception to fly fishing. You dangle something attractive in front of the enemy and hope they bite. The memo had been circulated through British naval intelligence back in 1939 and included dozens of creative ideas for misleading the Germans. One of them, buried in a long list of schemes, suggested planting false documents on a dead body and letting it wash ashore in enemy territory. The memo had several contributors, and one of them was a young naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming. The man who would later create James Bond apparently helped dream up one of the most audacious real-life spy operations in history. This detail alone would be enough to make the story feel made up. But it gets stranger. The idea sat dormant for years until two men in British intelligence pulled it off the shelf and turned it into a real plan. Their names were Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu of the Royal Navy and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of the Royal Air Force. Montagu was a barrister before the war, sharp and meticulous, the kind of man who thought in legal arguments and airtight logic. Cholmondeley was more of a dreamer, a creative thinker who could imagine the unlikely and then figure out how to make it real. Together, they formed one of the most unlikely partnerships of the war. Their plan was simple in concept and staggeringly complex in execution. They would obtain a dead body, dress it as a Royal Marines officer, equip it with a briefcase containing forged letters from senior Allied commanders, and arrange for it to wash ashore in a location where German spies would find the documents. The letters would suggest that the Allied invasion of southern Europe was targeting Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. If the Germans believed the letters, they would pull troops away from Sicily and send them to defend the wrong beaches. Getting approval for this plan was its own battle. Montagu and Cholmondeley had to convince some of the most senior figures in British intelligence that planting a dead body in the ocean was a sound military strategy. The 20 Committee, the secret group that ran double agents and deception operations from offices in central London, reviewed the plan and raised dozens of objections. What if the Spanish authorities performed a thorough autopsy and discovered the man had not drowned? What if the Germans suspected a plant and used the documents to feed disinformation back to the Allies? What if the body decomposed too quickly in the warm Mediterranean waters and the whole thing fell apart before the documents were even found? Montagu argued each point like the lawyer he was. The plan eventually received the blessing of the chiefs of staff, and, according to some accounts, Winston Churchill himself gave his approval with a single sentence. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "In war, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Whether Churchill actually said those exact words about this specific operation is debated, but the sentiment captured the philosophy behind Mincemeat perfectly. There was just one problem with this plan. They needed a body. And not just any body. They needed a corpse that could pass as a military officer who had died in a plane crash at sea. That meant the body could not show signs of violence, could not have been dead too long, and ideally would show evidence of drowning, or at least not contradict that explanation. In wartime London, dead bodies were not exactly in short supply, but finding one that met all these specific requirements and could be obtained without raising suspicion turned out to be far more difficult than anyone expected. Enter Glyndwr Michael. He was a 34-year-old Welshman who had been living on the streets of London. He had no known family, no permanent address, no military record. In January of 1943, he was found dead in an abandoned warehouse in King's Cross. The cause of death was phosphorus poisoning. He had eaten bread laced with rat poison, likely scrounged from the warehouse itself. Whether it was intentional or accidental, nobody ever determined for certain. His body was taken to a London morgue, and it was there that Montagu and Cholmondeley found him. The coroner, a man named Sir Bentley Purchase, agreed to release the body under the strictest secrecy. Purchase was one of very few civilians who knew the full scope of what was being planned, and he took that secret to his grave. The phosphorus poisoning was actually a concern for the team, because a detailed Spanish autopsy might reveal that the man had not died by drowning. But Montagu gambled on two things. First, that Spanish pathologists in a small coastal town would not perform a rigorous autopsy on what appeared to be a routine wartime drowning victim. And second, that the body would have spent enough time in seawater to obscure the finer details of cause of death. It was a calculated risk, and it kept Montagu up at night for weeks. If the Spanish doctors looked too closely, the entire operation would collapse before it even reached the Germans. Glyndwr Michael was about to become someone else entirely. The transformation was meticulous. They gave him a name, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They assigned him a service number, an identity card, and a rank that was high enough to be carrying sensitive documents, but not so high that the Germans would already know his face. Then they started building his life. Not just the military parts, but the personal parts too, the details that would make a stranger believe this was a real human being. They gave Major Martin a fiancée named Pam. They wrote love letters between the two of them, tender and slightly awkward in the way that real wartime letters actually sounded. The letters talked about the engagement, about plans for the future, about missing each other during wartime separation. They were not polished or romantic in a cinematic way. They were clumsy and earnest, the way a young military officer in love might actually write. Montagu reportedly agonized over getting the tone right, because anything too smooth would feel manufactured. They tucked a photograph of a woman into his wallet. The photograph was actually of a clerk at MI5 named Jean Leslie, who had agreed to pose as the fictional Pam without knowing the full scope of the operation. She was chosen because she looked like the kind of woman a Royal Marines officer might fall for, attractive but approachable, someone you could imagine meeting at a dance in wartime London. They gave him a receipt for an engagement ring from a London jeweler on Bond Street, a bill from his naval tailor, ticket stubs from a recent theatre show in the West End, and an overdue notice from Lloyd's Bank. They even gave him a stern letter from his father about the engagement, the kind of mildly disapproving note that any young officer's family might send. The father's letter expressed concern that the engagement was moving too quickly, that wartime romances often did not survive peacetime. It was the kind of small, irritating family friction that made Major Martin feel achingly human. Every item told a story. Every receipt placed Major Martin in a specific place at a specific time. If a German intelligence analyst went through his pockets, they would find the scattered debris of an ordinary British life, the kind of details that no forger would bother to invent, and that was the point. The personal effects were the camouflage. The real weapon was in the briefcase. Inside the leather case, chained to his wrist, were 2 letters. The first was from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, who was commanding Allied forces in North Africa. The letter discussed upcoming operations and casually mentioned that the real targets of the Allied invasion were Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily being used as a cover story for the actual attacks. The second letter was from Lord Louis Mountbatten to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. It contained similar references, reinforcing the idea that Sicily was a feint. The language in both letters was careful, not too specific, not too vague. The tone was informal enough to feel like a private communication between senior officers, but detailed enough to contain information that German intelligence would find irresistible. Montagu and Cholmondeley had studied captured German intelligence reports to understand exactly what kind of information the Abwehr considered credible. They wrote the letters to match those expectations. It was, in a sense, a script written for an audience of German spies. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. With the body prepared, the identity complete, and the documents sealed, the team needed to solve the final problem. How do you get a dead body into the water off the coast of Spain without anyone seeing you do it? The answer was a submarine. HMS Seraph, a British S-class submarine under the command of Lieutenant Norman Jewell, was chosen for the mission. The crew was told almost nothing about what they were carrying. The body of Glyndwr Michael, now officially Major William Martin, was packed into a modified steel canister filled with dry ice to preserve it during the voyage. The canister was loaded onto the submarine and listed on the manifest as optical instruments, which was the kind of vague military description that nobody would question. The submarine departed from Holy Loch in Scotland on the 19th of April, 1943. For 11 days, the Seraph traveled south through the Atlantic, around the coast of Portugal, and into position off the coast of southern Spain. The journey was tense in ways the crew could not fully understand. Submariners were used to secrecy, but something about this mission felt different. The sealed canister on deck was unusual, and the captain's behavior was unusually guarded. The few officers who had been briefed spent the voyage worrying about whether the dry ice would hold and whether the body inside the canister was still in presentable condition. If it had deteriorated too badly during the voyage, the mission was over. The crew had no idea that the metal canister strapped to their deck contained a human body. Lieutenant Jewell was one of only a handful of people aboard who knew the truth, and he later described the weight of that knowledge as one of the loneliest experiences of his naval career. Why Huelva? Because British intelligence knew that the German Abwehr had an active agent in the city. His name was Adolf Kloss, and he had a cozy relationship with several local Spanish officials. Spain was technically neutral during the war, but the Franco government leaned heavily toward the Axis powers, and Kloss had a reliable track record of getting his hands on sensitive documents that passed through Spanish authorities. The British were counting on exactly that kind of corruption. On the morning of April 30th, just before dawn, Lieutenant Jewell surfaced the submarine off the coast of Huelva. The crew opened the canister and removed the body of Major Martin. They fitted him with a life jacket, attached the briefcase chain to his wrist, and slid him into the dark water. A rubber dinghy was also placed in the water nearby to complete the illusion of a plane crash at sea. Then the submarine disappeared beneath the surface and headed for Gibraltar. The body drifted with the current toward the Spanish coastline. A few hours later, a local fisherman named Jose Antonio Rey Maria spotted the body floating near the shore. He pulled it from the water and reported the find to Spanish naval authorities in Huelva. What happened next unfolded almost exactly as Montague and Cholmondeley had predicted. Spanish officials recovered the briefcase and notified the British vice consul in Huelva as protocol demanded. But before returning the documents, they allowed German intelligence operatives, specifically Adolf Kloss and his network, to examine the letters inside the case. The envelopes were carefully opened, the contents were photographed, and copies were transmitted through German intelligence channels all the way up to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German military high command in Berlin. Then, the envelopes were resealed, and the briefcase was returned to the British with official assurances that nothing had been tampered with. The British, of course, knew exactly what had happened. Their forensic team examined the returned letters under ultraviolet light and confirmed that the seals had been broken and replaced. Tiny creases in the paper showed where the documents had been carefully extracted, photographed, and reinserted. The Spanish had done their best to cover their tracks, but the British had anticipated exactly this kind of handling and had built in forensic markers to detect tampering. The bait had been taken. The question was whether the fish would swallow the hook. When confirmation arrived that the documents had been passed to the Germans, Montague sent a coded telegram to Churchill that has since become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. It read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker." Those 6 words told Churchill everything he needed to know. The Germans had not merely glanced at the documents, they had consumed them completely. Back in London, Montague and Cholmondeley waited for the operational proof. The answer came through the most reliable source the British had, Bletchley Park. The codebreakers at Bletchley had been intercepting and decrypting German communications through the Enigma machine for years, and now those intercepts told a story that made Montague and Cholmondeley want to shout. The Germans had bought it completely. In mid-May, decoded messages revealed that the German High Command had alerted forces in Greece to prepare for an imminent Allied invasion. Additional troops and equipment were being shipped to Sardinia. Coastal fortifications along the Greek coastline were being reinforced. Panzer divisions that had been earmarked for Sicily were rerouted to the Peloponnese. And the orders came from the very top. Some officers within the Abwehr did raise doubts. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, had concerns about the documents, but the counter-argument was persuasive. The personal effects in Martin's pockets, the love letters, the theatre stubs, the bank notice, all pointed to a real person living a real life. If this was a British deception, the thinking went, why would they bother forging a cranky letter from his father? The clutter killed the skepticism, exactly as Montague had intended. Hitler himself reviewed the intelligence from the Spanish documents and decided that they were genuine. The Führer had personally ordered the redeployment. A single corpse and a handful of forged letters had convinced the supreme commander of the German military to defend the wrong coastline. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why the operation mattered. The German garrison on Sicily was not just weakened, it was fundamentally undermined. An entire panzer division was pulled from the island and sent to Greece. Naval mine-laying operations were redirected. Luftwaffe squadrons were repositioned. The beaches that the Allies were actually about to storm were left with a fraction of the defense that would have been waiting for them. On July 10, 1943, Operation Husky began. Over 160,000 Allied troops landed on the shores of Sicily in the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen at that point. The landings hit 2 main sectors, with American forces under General George Patton taking the western beaches and British forces under General Bernard Montgomery taking the eastern coast near Syracuse. They faced stiff resistance from Italian defenders and from the German units that remained on the island, but the overall German presence was significantly thinner than it should have been. Reinforcements that could have been waiting on those beaches were instead dug into positions along the Greek coastline, scanning the horizon for an invasion fleet that was never coming. The invasion succeeded. Syracuse fell on the first day. The port city of Palermo fell within 2 weeks. Sicily was fully in Allied hands within 38 days. It was a decisive victory that knocked Italy out of the war, toppled Mussolini from power, and opened the door to the invasion of mainland Europe. Military historians have debated the exact number of lives saved by Operation Mincemeat, but the consensus is that the number runs into the thousands, possibly tens of thousands. If Germany had reinforced Sicily with the full weight of its Mediterranean forces, the invasion could have stalled on the beaches. The war in Europe might have dragged on even longer than it did. Instead, the Allies punched through with far fewer casualties than expected. And the deception was so complete that even after Sicily fell, some German commanders still believed the real invasion of Greece was coming, which, looking back, was either incredibly brilliant or incredibly foolish on their part. After the war ended, the full scope of Operation Mincemeat remained classified for years. But in 1953, Ewan Montagu published a book called The Man Who Never Was, revealing the broad outlines of the operation for the first time. The book became an international bestseller and was adapted into a film in 1956. Montagu became something of a minor celebrity in post-war Britain, though he always deflected credit and insisted that the operation had been a team effort involving dozens of people across multiple branches of military intelligence. Charles Cholmondeley, by contrast, remained in the shadows. He never sought public attention and rarely discussed his role in the operation. He returned to civilian life after the war and lived quietly in England, never writing a memoir, never sitting for interviews, never claiming his share of the credit. He died in 1982, largely unknown to the public, despite having co-designed one of the most consequential deceptions in modern warfare. Jean Leslie, the woman whose photograph had served as Major Martin's fictional fiancée, lived to be 99 years old. She only learned the full truth about how her picture had been used many years after the war ended. Lieutenant Jewell, the submarine commander who had carried the body across the Atlantic and slid it into the water off Huelva, went on to have a distinguished naval career, but rarely spoke about that one morning in the darkness off the Spanish coast. And then there was Glyndwr Michael, the man whose body made it all possible. For decades, his identity was kept secret. The gravestone in Huelva read, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, with the epitaph that he had served his country and given his life in service. It was not until 1996 that his real name was added to the headstone. A small plaque was placed beneath the original inscription acknowledging Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin. The man who had died alone in a London warehouse, nameless and forgotten, had been given a second life. And in that second life, he had helped win a war. The story has continued to fascinate people in the decades since. Ben Macintyre, the British historian and journalist, published a deeply researched book on the operation in 2010 that drew on newly declassified files and revealed details that Montagu had omitted or obscured in his own account. A feature film based on Macintyre's book was released in 2021, starring Colin Firth as Ewan Montagu. The film brought the story to a new generation, and it captured something essential about the operation. The audacity of it, the absurdity of it. The fact that two mid-ranking intelligence officers talked their way into approval for a plan that involved dressing up a dead stranger and dropping him into the ocean with a fake girlfriend and a fake briefcase full of fake letters, and that it actually worked. There is something almost uncomfortable about how well it worked. The operation succeeded not because the German intelligence apparatus was incompetent. The Abwehr was skeptical by nature. They analyzed documents, cross-referenced claims, and looked for inconsistencies. The reason Mincemeat worked is that Montagu and Cholmondeley understood their enemy. They knew what German analysts wanted to believe, and they built a fiction that confirmed those beliefs. The personal items in Major Martin's pockets were not just window dressing. They were designed to disarm suspicion by making the body feel ordinary. A real person would have theatre stubs and a cranky letter from his dad. A planted body would just have the documents. The clutter was the con. It was espionage designed like a novel, which makes a certain kind of sense given that one of the men who first imagined it went on to write spy novels for a living. The broader legacy of Operation Mincemeat goes beyond the battle for Sicily. It demonstrated that strategic deception, when executed with enough precision and psychological insight, could alter the outcome of an entire military campaign. The lessons of Mincemeat influenced Allied deception planning for the rest of the war, including the massive Operation Bodyguard program that preceded the D-Day landings at Normandy in 1944. The same principle applied, and many of the same people were involved. If you can make the enemy believe the attack is coming somewhere else, you can save thousands of lives before the first shot is ever fired. Glyndwr Michael was buried in Glyndwr with full military honors under a name that was never his. He was mourned by people who did not know him, and he protected soldiers he would never meet. He had no idea, of course, that any of this would happen. He died in obscurity, and through an accident of bureaucracy and wartime desperation, he became one of the most important figures in the Allied war effort. Not because of anything he did in life, but because of what was done with him after death. His headstone sits in the cemetery of Nuestra Señora de la Soledad in Glyndwr to this day. The inscription, updated after decades of secrecy, finally tells the truth. And every year, visitors come from around the world to stand in front of it and think about the strange chain of events that turned a forgotten man into the spy who fooled Hitler. If this story gripped you the way it gripped me, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me which part of Operation Mincemeat you think was the most insane detail.